Welcome back to The Empire Never Ended. We're here, Fritz, Ray, Boris, and joined once again with our good friend Kemal.
Hey.
How are you guys doing?
Pretty good. Now, Kemal's going to take us through some weird history of Gabriele D'Annunzio and Fiume slash Rijeka. And I guess we'll just dive right in. I think we might also go into some other stuff as well if we get around to it. This is going to be kind of a laid-back episode. How you doing today, Kemal?
I'm doing all right. Can't complain.
I mean, this was actually your idea to do this episode, so I guess...
That's true.
Guilty. Yeah.
This is your fault.
Yeah, it's classic me, as they say.
All right.
So I thought we'd just talk a little bit about Fiume and all the crazy shit that happened there.
Mm-hmm.
So a little background. I had previously joined you guys for a conversation on the intricacies of Croatian nationalism in the 19th century. And here I'll be kind of giving a coda to that story with the fall of Austria-Hungary and the weird kind of aftermath that happened, especially in this region here. So just to kind of rehash a bit, within Austria-Hungary, there were some pretty major political divisions, administrative divisions, where you had the Austrian portion of the empire and the Hungarian portion of the empire. Within the Hungarian portion of the empire, you had the various kingdoms, including the Kingdom of Croatia-Slavonia. And around, I guess it was 1867, you get something new coming into it. And this is around the time that there's a settlement reached, kind of defining the status of Croatia within Hungary and Austria-Hungary. And you have this strange little city-state coming into being. And of course, it's a much older city, but really this is the birth of the city of Fiume, as we now know it, and Rijeka, as it's now called.
And for those that don't know either Italian or Croatian, the city is just straight up named River.
Yeah. Right.
It's called River, but it's on the sea. It does have a river, but
it does have a river, and the river is also called Little River.
Great.
So if anyone's confused here, yes, the river is very important. Not because it's an important river. It's actually a very short river that pretty much goes to nowhere, right? It's not like a major route or anything, but it's important mainly because it's been used as a border. And so what we actually have with Rijeka, or Fiume, at the time Fiume, is you have these internal divisions within Austria-Hungary, and the Hungarian portion, yes, being one of several. And the Hungarian portion really wanted to have its own port city. And so a settlement was reached that determined that the city of Fiume would become the Austrian port city, or excuse me, the Hungarian port city.
Yeah.
And so right now in what is today Rijeka, to the west, you have the neighborhood of Kantrida, which was actually part of Austria. It's part of the Austrian section of the empire. And then just to the east, right along the river, you have the neighborhood of Sušak, which was part of the Kingdom of Croatia, Slavonia. And in between, you have the city center, which became an independent city-state that had a semi-autonomous status that reported directly to the parliament in Budapest. So essentially, you have a new
it became
political
independent
entity.
in a sense of like not being part of any of these other
right.
Yeah.
It wasn't a part of one of these kingdoms. It wasn't, it was a city-state answerable directly to Budapest.
Is this the last city-state in Europe then?
No, Monaco's still a city-state. And so
I mean,
is
last
San
is in like
Marino.
most recently
Yeah,
created.
but that's what I wanted to say. It was not an independent city-state in a real sense. It was not a sovereign state. It was a part of Austro-Hungary, and it had independent in the sense that it wasn't a part of any of the crown lands of Austro-Hungary. So it was kind of an...
And even though it reported to Hungary, it was completely detached from any Hungarian territory. I mean, it didn't connect to Hungary in any way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Physically. Yeah.
Yeah. The technical term was like corpus separatum. And so it was within the Kingdom of Hungary. However, it was highly autonomous. And it was a very small city. And it was a mixed city, right? Like, I mean, it didn't even have a majority ethnic group. I think it had a plurality of Italian speakers at the time, but it was very mixed. And it was entirely insignificant until the late 19th century when it became the Hungarian port city. And because it became the Hungarian port city and was connected by rail, it became the site of major investment from Hungary in terms of infrastructure building, and they developed port and extensive trade, and it became a boom town, and it suddenly like ballooned in size. And because of this, it was thriving within Austria-Hungary as this kind of, I heard it described recently as a Hong Kong on the Adriatic.
All right.
So it was a boom town. It's not like, these other Mediterranean cities that go back, thousands of years. There are some, Roman ruins and stuff around, but the overwhelming majority of the city was built in the second half of the 19th century.
Yeah, it looks like different from most of the cities on the coast in Croatia. It has a more kind of...
like it doesn't have that kind of walled city, the ancient part.
It looks more like a Central European city. Maybe it's similar to Trieste in that it's like kind of a more Central European looking town on the coast of Adriatic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, the architecture is clearly not Venetian, right? Like most of the coast.
Yeah.
It's very much this kind of Austro-Hungarian style.
Yeah.
And because it was built in this time of secessionist architecture. And so it had this status. And, just across the river, there was another city that came into being that was part of the Kingdom of Croatia, Slavonia, and that was Sušak. And it had, entirely separate laws. It was part of that kingdom. However, it also thrived because of the trade that was coming in, and it also was growing in this time. And to the west, you have Kantrida, and eventually you get another city coming about in this time. It was called Abbazio, now called Opatia. And this was basically an Austrian resort city, one of the earliest resort cities in Europe. And it was built for tourism. And so you have this kind of thriving port city developing towards the end of Austria-Hungary, like really in the final decades of Austria-Hungary. And you end up with this weird situation with the end of World War I and the demise of Austria-Hungary, when Woodrow Wilson famously announced among his 14 points that the peoples would have self-determination, the peoples of Austria specifically is what he said. And this idea that, oh, okay, well, we're going to redraw the map of Europe and, you know, have this kind of official embrace of nationalism as the new mode of being to create a peace to end all wars was the idea of, you know, the Paris Peace Accords. This was the plan that, oh, as long as every nation has their own state and their own land, then we'll just have peace forever. And of course, didn't really take into account that nations are bullshit and
states aren't great either.
Yeah, highly debated. You know, there's not this strong sense among people, and also the fact that a lot of different people tended to live in the same cities,
right?
And so,
yeah, it's the point of a cosmopolitan area,
right? Exactly. And so you end up with this kind of weird situation where you have this really, like, honestly, fairly insignificant city. Okay, it was the second most important city economically for the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, whatever.
Quite a distinction.
In terms of world peace, like what kind of role does the city of like less than 100,000 people have? And actually, it turned out to be an extremely tricky situation that threatened to derail the entire peace accords. You know, the world had invested so much into these peace accords, this idea that it would be peace forever. And it turns out there's this city that no one had actually heard of before, to be honest. Like, you know, why are people in Japan suddenly writing about Fiume? What's happening? And the reason is, it's kind of tricky, is you have these administrative divisions and you have a bunch of ethnic diversity, and they're trying to figure out what to do here. And the Italians believe that, well, you know, it should be Italian. And the reason for this was like, you did say that we would go by the ethnic majorities and have self-determination. And you do have at least a plurality within Fiume that was Italian speaking. It was the largest group. And so they said it's kind of obvious that it should go to Italy, right? I mean, this is what you said, Wilson. And the newly formed Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes said, okay, but I mean, you're going by this kind of artificial boundary that was drawn by an empire that no longer exists. And if we include Sushak, and I should say they're literally like conjoined. There's the canal that divides the two. I mean, you could easily toss a stone across. It's very narrow.
And they're literally neighborhoods now, right? I mean, they're
arguably the same neighborhood.
Yeah.
So they're saying, well, if you include Sushak in this, I mean, you actually have a Slavic plurality, and shouldn't it go to, you know, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later called Yugoslavia? And this became like a really odd sticking point, and it threatened to derail everything. Like, how do we even draw the boundaries of a city, let alone countries? Like, we don't know. We don't know how to add up these groups, because now you're just talking about like the majority within a particular neighborhood of like a metropolitan area, of a fairly small metropolitan area. And so it became a contentious issue. And I believe because of this, the Italian delegation had pulled out of the peace accords, especially when Wilson came out in favor of granting the city to the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. And they're like, this is entirely hypocritical and seems to be just anti-Italian. Because, I mean, he wasn't the biggest fan of Italy, right? And the mayor of New York at the time, I think it was the same time. It might have been
LaGuardia,
slightly later. Was LaGuardia? Yeah.
Yeah.
And LaGuardia had actually been part of the U.S. consulate in Fiume and had played football, soccer for the Americans, had played for like the Fiume football team. And he was all in favor of giving Fiume to Italy. And in the end, in order to, try and deal with this, and they decided, well, maybe Fiume should become an independent city-state properly as like a country.
Okay.
And this was the leading proposal, and this was agreed on by all sides. Like this would be the future of Fiume.
Okay, yeah. Problem solved.
And there was even talk that it would become like the seat of the League of Nations. Jesus. Right? Like, what is this weird little city-state that we have here on the Adriatic? And what do we do about it? And so this is how it ended up being resolved. Now, you have a situation, I think it was late 1919, where you have a lot of pissed off veterans who had served in the Italian army. And, they had won the war. Italy was part of the winning team, but they felt that they were losing the peace. Won the war, but losing the peace. Because they had been promised, all of these territories that had Italian majorities within Austria-Hungary. Fiume wasn't one of the cities that they were promised. They were promised Zadar, and they were given Zadar. Zadar is further south. It's in Dalmatia. And you end up with like Zadar itself becoming part of Italy in this time. Just like the city center, really.
Just the city center, right? And it was completely kind of surrounded by Yugoslavia. Yeah.
It was an enclave.
Very weird. Yeah.
And so you have these veterans and they're pissed off, and they end up rallying around a poet who had become by far the most popular person in Italy. And this guy, his name is Gabriele D'Annunzio. He was a poet who was involved in like the decadent movement. He wrote about sexual conquest and exploits, and just kind of throwing off bourgeois morality. And he wrote about like his own experiences, right? Like he would brag about his womanizing, and he'd go deeply into debt and then just move from one city to the next to flee the debt collectors and then write about it.
Douchebag Italian dude.
Well, he became extremely popular. And
I think he fled Italy at one point because of this debt.
He did.
He moved to France, right?
For a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the reasons, you wonder, like, how could this poet be so popular in a country where, like, what was it? Half the population couldn't even read at the time. And a big part of it...
He had other talents.
Right. So a big part of it was, like, his role in the First World War.
Yeah.
And he was, like, this kind of G.I. Joe figure.
He was a fucking daredevil.
He was a daredevil.
Yeah.
He was in the army. He was in the Navy. He was in the Air Force.
He flew with Wilbur Wright.
Yeah, that's right.
Did.
That's right. Yeah.
This guy had a crazy fucking life.
Yeah.
Really did. And one of the big things that he did was, like, he won the propaganda war.
Yeah.
And, the Italians weren't particularly proud of their military exploits. Especially because, the Italian state and the parliament was seen as pretty wishy-washy about the First World War. There was heavy reluctance to even be involved in the war. And you actually saw splits occurring within the socialist movement of those who favored intervention, like a young socialist at the time, Benito Mussolini. Then you had others who thought they should stay out of it. And, once they were involved, it was still like there wasn't this total commitment, right? Mm-hmm. And so people who were actually involved in fighting the war felt rather betrayed by their own government during the war, and even more so afterwards. And so what the nuncio was trying to do during the war, and I'd say quite effectively, is bring about some morale on the Italian side. And he did this through his most two famous acts. You have one called The Mockery of Baccar.
Yeah.
Where there's a small town.
Bucari. Sorry.
Esatto. So there's a small town not far from Fiume, and it's called Baccar, and it was basically a heavily fortified harbor where the Austro-Hungarian Navy had their forces based. And the nuncio came in with some ships and launched some torpedoes that I don't think any of them even hit.
No, they got caught up in like fishing nets and
right.
Not one of them hit a target out of 6 of them. Not one of them. 5 of them got entangled in nets.
Yeah, I mean, fishing nets are tough. You gotta do.
Yeah, most of them did not explode, and then one of them just exploded on its own in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah,
nice.
Exactly. So, but they also put like messages in bottles and threw them into the harbor. And it was basically the message was like, you think you're safe, but we made it into your most protected, defended harbor.
That was the trick then, that they snuck in. They were successfully in there.
They came to mock the Navy. And this was the mockery. They're like, you think you're safe? Wrong. And this is very similar to another action that he took, not as a Navy man, but as an Air Force man.
Guy was everywhere.
Where he led a squadron over the enemy capital of Vienna.
Right, the famous flight of Vienna, yeah.
Yeah, and they dropped something like, 400,000 leaflets.
Right.
And
it's a 700-mile trip there and back. It's quite a feat.
It was also kind of funny because he wrote this like relatively long text, which was like very poetic, but it was only in Italian. They didn't translate it to German.
Fantastic.
So literally nobody could read it.
Yeah. And the leaflets are like, they look like an Italian flag, don't they? The leaflets.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like, it may as well be a menu for a restaurant. Nobody knows. Nobody knows what the fuck it says.
Promotion for a pizza shop.
And they also did drop some leaflets that were written in German.
Yeah.
Okay.
But not the ones written by D'Annunzio. He just did his in Italian.
Well, poetry can't be translated, Kemal.
No.
Exactly.
And I guess the point was for it to be a propaganda action back home, not really in Austria, but for Italians, I guess. So it was...
Right. And the idea is we could be dropping bombs right now.
Yeah.
Right.
But we're dropping leaflets. We will never give up. Look how brave we are. Long live Italy. And so he was quite popular with the troops, and he did see some action as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
in which branch?
Yeah, for real. Jesus.
A bit of all of them. So yeah, he risked his life. He wasn't just talk. He did this, and he became immensely popular in Italy, especially among soldiers. And he was the one who came up with the idea that the peace that Italy had won was a mutilated peace, right? Like that they were losing the peace despite having won the war.
And it sounds very familiar, I have to say. This phrase.
Yeah. I've heard some other people in the region say that.
It's something that was like repeated.
I think every single.
I mean, in the 90s was especially repeated by the Serbian side in the war in Yugoslavia.
Mm-hmm.
But after World War I, too, I mean, you had the Hungarians were saying that, the Bulgarians were saying, everybody that lost territory was saying that.
So we win the wars, but we lose the peace. Yeah.
Yeah.
So defeat and victory and defeat. It's all covered.
And of course, like the Italians were horrified that, the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes was even counted as one of the victorious parties in the negotiations because the majority of it had been under Austria-Hungary. These were the same people that they had been fighting.
Right.
Yeah, particularly the Italians, right? I mean, some of the major battles in World War I that the Italians fought were against Croats and Bosniak forces in northern Italy. They built a mosque in, I think, Bosniak Austro-Hungarian troops built a mosque in somewhere in Italy or whatever, which is like the first mosque in that region or whatever.
Not to mention the fact that they had also been fighting against Fiume, which was Austria-Hungary.
Right.
And, a lot of people in the city of Fiume had served or, lost family members fighting against the Italians. And so, of course, it's a really contentious idea.
Yeah.
But what ends up happening is D'Annunzio kind of gathers a big group of people. I should say before, during these negotiations, what you had in Fiume was representatives from all the allied armies, like kind of serving as a guard within the city. You had British troops, you had American troops, you had Italian troops, you had French troops, and they were all just kind of like sitting in the city, waiting for its status to be resolved. Now, what happens is D'Annunzio gets together with a bunch of former soldiers, including a bunch of soldiers who had Italian soldiers who had been stationed in Fiume, who recently got kicked out because they had been fighting with the French.
Does that include the Arditi? Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. The dreaded elite ground forces.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I should also say being a thriving port city, Fiume, especially like the center of Fiume, was almost like entirely brothels at the time.
Oh.
Brothels and bars and, drug dealers everywhere. And it was like the seedy underbelly kind of thing because it was a port city. And then it was basically occupied by a bunch of different military personnel in a time when all trade on which the city depended had been cut off due to the war. And so people in the city are suffering. You have all these troops stationed in the city. And of course, there's going to be a lot of drinking and debauchery and a massive rise in the amount of brothels in the city and everything.
Did D'Annunzio, he's from there or he moved there because of this?
No, he's not.
Because it sounds like really him, doesn't it?
I think he had been to Fiume for like less than a few hours at one point,
and then just fell in love with it for obvious reasons.
Yeah. He would come to fall in love with it, and part of the reason that he fell in love with it was because of this image that he created of it, of Fiume as the embodiment of the Italian woman who has been taken advantage of by these foreign men.
Oh my God! Okay,
this typical shit,
But by the way, do you know what drugs were they dealing in Fiume? The dealers.
I know cocaine was the big drug in Fiume.
Okay.
Also very D'Annunzio somehow. If I was going to pick a drug,
massive amounts of cocaine.
Well, it sounds like the whole thing was fueled by a lot of coke. The whole operation.
Yeah, this entire story is fueled by coke, from its inception to the recording of this podcast.
Yeah.
Kemal's cutting lines as we speak on this chat.
Gotta get into the spirit of D'Annunzio, We're gonna fly to Vienna. We're just gonna drop fucking menus on their fucking heads. They won't know what the fuck's going on. Yeah.
Drop those menus.
Aren't you like a naval captain? Whatever, man. I can do it. It's the same thing. Yeah. There you go. My impression of D'Annunzio.
Nice. So what ended up happening is like all of these troops gathered in Italy, not too far from Fiume, and a lot of them were like pissed off. Some of them had just been kicked out of Fiume because they had been fighting with French soldiers. And there's this kind of epic scene where the women of Fiume apparently laid a bunch of Italian flags down on the street in front of the Italian barracks because they didn't want the Italians to leave, the soldiers, and they were begging them to stay. And they figured that they would not, march over their own flags, but they were ordered to, and they totally did. and some of the soldiers cried out, like, "We will return, we will return." And this kind of became like the motto of Italian irredentism.
Hey, Kemal, you've got an etymological background. Tell me this: when like the French and Italians have trouble, are they having romantic problems?
Oh,
nice.
Etymologically speaking,
absolutely.
Thank you.
I'll grant you that one.
Thank you.
So anyway, all of these different troops from all kinds of like factions within the military, right? Like you have these hardcore shock troops, the Arditi, you have like naval troops, you have Air Force people involved, and a lot of them have, essentially like left their units and gathered around D'Annunzio. And it wasn't even clear if he was going to be a part of this. He had just talked about it, but they all gathered together and they're all wearing different uniforms and everything. And one of these troops, a former Air Force fighter named Guido Keller, ends up stealing like some military vehicles.
All right.
And they load them into the military vehicles. And D'Annunzio gets into a red convertible.
Just covered in white powder, like all over his mustache.
Just
the Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas style.
Backcountry.
It's a red shark, filling trunk full of drugs.
So
we were somewhere around Fiume when the drugs began to take hold.
They kicked in right about that time.
But this is not only like a joke. Like there is like evidence that they were like coked up. Some of them, no?
Oh yeah. No, this is very serious.
Okay.
They did massive amounts of cocaine.
They had a serious drug problem, Ray.
Come on, what are you talking about?
That's how fascism began. This is the story of proto-fascism.
So they end up driving to Fiume, and there is an Italian officer who's in charge of the troops.
There's a few thousand of them, right? Or how many?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's a few thousand of them.
Good God.
And they come to Fiume, and this Italian officer had been specifically ordered not to let D'Annunzio in.
Mm-hmm.
Like he was told, don't let anybody in, but specifically, do not let D'Annunzio in. Like this will be a problem.
Get Paulie to do it. Get him to do it. Nobody likes it.
And so D'Annunzio rolls up, and he's confronted by this officer as he tries to enter. And the officer says, I can't let you in. I'm under orders to shoot you if you try to enter Fiume. And in like this kind of classic D'Annunzio moment, he pulls open his jacket.
Oh God!
And on his shirt, he has all of the medals that he won during the war, and points to the medal over his heart and goes, "Shoot me here if you want. Try it."
Man, he sunned that fucking soldier, damn.
And all of the Italian soldiers who were behind this officer, they were, looking at the national hero. And if they were ordered to shoot him, they would probably just shoot their commanding officer first.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so he strolls in, not a shot fired, and takes the city with a bunch of
with theater
pissed off veterans, right? His whole crew. And so they come in and they manage to take the city. Now, his demand when he takes the city is that it become part of Italy, because he is first and foremost an Italian nationalist.
All right.
He wants it to become part of Italy. demands annexation. And his biggest opponent in this isn't like the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. His biggest opponent is the liberals in the Italian parliament who are willing to let this city become an independent city or go into foreign hands, right?
I'm sorry. Can you imagine just getting word of this in the Italian parliament? Like, listen, Giovanni, I don't know how to tell you this, but that D'Annunzio guy did a ton of cocaine, got 1,000 people together, and stormed the city of Fiume. But he says that we need to accept him as part of Italy now. I don't really want to.
Well, yeah, exactly. I'm pretty sure. Are you reading that transcript?
That's the transcript.
Yeah. And, there were obvious problems with this, mainly, the peace accords and international order, and the fact that, Italy at the time was completely dependent on the U.S., which was deeply against the idea. And so they refused to annex Italy. Or Italy refused to annex Fiume, right?
So Fiume annexed Italy. Problem solved.
Yeah. Problem solved. No, so you end up with this kind of weird situation where, like, D'Annunzio has personally taken Fiume and is telling Italy, like, it's yours now. And Italy's like, yeah, we can't. Yeah.
We'd love to, but
here's the thing. There's like...
They're just doing that, like, Mediterranean thing, right? Where they refuse a few times, and then they finally accept it.
Right.
I really can't.
That's pretty much what happened.
Take it. All right. He just didn't wait long enough. Yeah.
Well, this was the thing. That was exactly the thought in Fiume at the time.
Oh, there you go.
This was exactly the thought. Like, they have to put up with these, like, fucking liberals in Rome, and sooner or later they're just going to accept that Fiume is Italian. And so they decide to hole out in Fiume and wait for the annexation. And it ends up being, like, well over a year.
They're just any day now.
And this is the thing, like, so you basically end up with a city that's been squatted with, like,
by cokeheads.
Yeah, none of the
armed cokeheads.
None of the powers, the great powers, like, have control over the city. It's just kind of sitting there.
Does anybody even want control of it? It sounds like nobody's in a hurry to do anything about this.
Well, I mean, it was a contentious issue, and they needed to solve it, and they eventually went with this idea that it should be an independent state.
Right.
But the problem was it was suddenly squatted by a bunch of coked up Italian veterans who said, no, it should be part of Italy. And they're like, oh man, we can't do that though. And, there's, like, international law and all this kind of stuff.
And a limited supply of cocaine in the world. The clock's ticking.
So they basically, like, tried to wait it out and to see what would happen with this. And so D'Annunzio was kind of in this odd position where, like, he and his troops were now, like, in control of Fiume, and no one would take it. And, there was still, like, for a time, a municipal government that was kind of running things as they used to be. But he had taken over the governor's palace and was trying to drum up support. And so he did what, how should I put this? Anyone who's involved in the kind of, like, anarcho-left scene is familiar with squats knows that different factions tend to emerge, right? So basically what you end up with is a city that is now ruled by the faction that we can call the fucking artists. Right?
Right.
So,
oh yes,
this is essentially what we have. And so the artists.
So this is the birthplace of fascism. So a lot of coke, artists running the city.
So it's basically a bunch of guys doing coke going, man, what if we just did this?
Yeah.
Fucking great idea, man. Let's fucking do it right now. I'm ready, man. Fucking pumped.
Exactly.
Let's do it.
And they called this like the philosophy of the pure deed or the act, right? Like it was about action. And, as far as like a philosophical basis, these guys were coming from all over the board. There were people who were just straight up hardcore Italian nationalists. There were people who were syndicalists, nationalist syndicalists, anarcho-syndicalists, socialists, liberals, like basically, the full spectrum of people. And, it's a very diverse group, but you end up with certain factions kind of becoming more powerful within it. And one of the key people involved in this time was the guy who had stolen those trucks, the pilot, Guido Keller. Now, Guido became the kind of right-hand man of the nuncio. He was the only one of these legionnaires that was actually allowed to speak directly with the nuncio because the nuncio liked him. And Guido was a very interesting guy. Like the nuncio, he was very inspired by one particular philosopher, Federico Nietzsche. So he, like the nuncio, had this idea that, there are people who act in the world and that this is your role. This is what it means to live. It is to act. And they were both occultists, by the way. They were heavily rooted in the occult. What is it? The Martinist, right?
Martinist, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is like an esoteric form of Christianity that I think first appeared in the 18th century and was organized as like an order in the 19th century. And it's connected to the Freemasons somehow, which D'Annunzio was also a Freemason and even like a Grandmaster. Yeah.
So one of the key ideas of the Nietzschean philosophy, especially in this more occultist version, is this idea of eternal return. And to kind of lay the basics for it, it's this idea that there is no afterlife. When you die, basically what happens is you return and you live the exact same life. Everything is identical. And in fact, the life you're living now isn't the first time you've lived this. You've always been living this life and you always will.
I actually just got to season 3 of Westworld. This is
great.
Yeah.
So
I'm with you.
So yeah, like it's, on the one hand, very like, a very crippling idea, but for these people, it was very, inspirational. It's like, oh, we're always going to be doing this. And so you need to live your life to the max. And it's this idea that, you should make your life into a work of art. Like
freaking me out a little.
Yeah. Yeah, well, a lot. So this idea...
It doesn't actually seem that fucked up and crazy, though.
Well, hold on, because if you start to imagine... I'm picturing it sort of like that Tom Cruise movie.
It's basically just Groundhog Day, right?
But yeah, but with armaments and cocaine and the idea that life should be art, and you can do that with guns and coke.
Yeah, but Bill Murray starts doing crazy shit in Groundhog Day, too, because...
that's what I'm saying. Things get dark. Yeah,
I guess so.
But yeah, with Groundhog Day, at least every day was different. He'd wake up and he'd have a memory of it. He wouldn't be living the exact same day every day with nothing changing. And this is how they understood eternal return. This is how Nietzsche understood it. And the occultist, like the next time you live, nothing will change. Every decision you make, every action you take will be just as it was before. And this is symbolized by the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, which became the symbol that they put on the flag of Fiume. So they totally embraced this.
And so the Italians will keep on returning to Fiume for eternity. This is the philosophy
every
of
time.
Eternal eternity.
Nothing changes. So, and this group, specifically like the faction led by Keller, they were some rather strange people. Like Keller himself was from this kind of like very well-to-do family from Milan.
Which D'Annunzio was also from like a rich family, right?
I'm not really surprised.
His father was a mayor of the city where he was born, and he was like a rich landowner. So
right.
Okay.
So I think Keller's family were industrialists, and Keller had this kind of like attitude that the stuff that the kind of constraints that bourgeois society places on you are just utter bullshit, and you can go ahead and do whatever you want, especially if it's like somewhat shocking. So I don't know if this is true of his time in Fiume, but at least in his time in Italy, he would often sleep in a tree. He would sleep naked in a tree house with his pet eagle.
Fantastic.
And he had adopted a donkey. I can't remember the donkey's name. Camellino the donkey.
Okay.
And he taught Camellino how to sit in the passenger seat of his car. And he would drive around with Camellino.
That's cute.
And I think Camellino was later killed by an Austro-Hungarian airstrike. But anyway.
God damn, that shouldn't be as funny as...
Hey, that's tragic. Come on.
Glorious life he lived, though.
Camellino, no!
And Keller's co-pilot was a fucking skull that he found that he put like aviator goggles on.
Oh my God.
And he would fly around with his skull as a co-pilot.
Man, they don't make coke like they used to, huh?
No, they don't.
There was a Serbian militia guy in Bosnia that did that as well. But he put a UN helmet on his skull and put it on his truck and drove it around.
Classy.
At that point, it's just kind of derivative, though, isn't it?
Yeah. It's not original.
Yeah, where's his donkey?
Yeah. So Guido Keller's faction, in Fiume, he's actually in charge of a few different groups. One of them is like the core group of bodyguards for D'Annunzio, and what were they called? The disperata, like the desperate. And they actually organized in a completely non-hierarchical way. They got rid of uniforms entirely, and basically went around the whole time in their bathing suits, right?
Of course, I think I would have guessed that, yeah.
So there's some pictures of Guido like posing on the seaside as like a modern day Neptune. And so they would basically go around, half naked, if not completely naked. They were also nudists.
God, nudism was so big back then. Too.
Yeah.
It's fucking funny to think about now.
So they would do that. He had another group that was called the Uskoki. And this comes from a South Slavic word, uskok, which is someone who like jumps in, right? And the original uskotsi were pirates primarily, who would attack Venetian and Ottoman vessels in the Adriatic. And so not too far from Fiume. In fact, they would sell their goods in Fiume. And so the new Uskotsi, or Uskoki in Italian.
So they adopted a Slavic word. Interesting.
Yes, they did.
Cultural appropriation.
A historical one at that time. But
yes.
So what they would do is they were essentially pirates. And, there was a blockade on Fiume and nothing was coming in. They were trying to, get the Nunzio out. And so they basically resorted to piracy to bring in food and goods. And I don't know if anyone has ever seen the Miyazaki movie of Porco Rosso, where you have these like air pirates. Like that takes place in Fiume at this time, and these would have been the Uskoki. They were air pirates, and they had these seaplanes, and they would go out and hijack like Italian vessels and steal their goods or hold them ransom. And from what I understand, because D'Annunzio was so popular in Italy, a lot of these like captains kind of tipped off D'Annunzio and the Uskoki to say, "Hey, I have a nice shipment, come in and you've seen Goodfellas, right? Like,
yeah.
It's like they'll get a little cut, it's fine, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, those damn pirates,"
right?
And so they would basically, be committing these acts of piracy and come back to this little pirate utopia that they had created.
Quite a life.
Furthermore, they were into yoga. This was a very big thing for them.
So this is still the Keller group, or
this is Keller's group. So a little subgroup that Keller formed, which was like kind of the strangest among them, was called the yoga group. And I don't think yoga was particularly popular back in the day, but they were doing public yoga and often nude, and they established a magazine that was just called Yoga, and it had its little like Rosicrucian 5-petal rose and a swastika as the two symbols of it. So they had the yoga group, a lot of orgies, and at least a lot of the material that I read, I think because, people who deal with right-wing figures today are always kind of surprised to find out that, they're not entirely homophobic. A lot of them point out that Keller was a very open homosexual, and I would say probably pansexual. And was involved in these very public drug-fueled orgies all over Fiume.
No, I'm just going to my yoga group.
No. Well, that's the thing. It wasn't even clandestine. It was actually encouraged. It's like, no, we're not doing yoga. We're just having like raucous gay sex. And then sneak off to do yoga, right? And this is kind of this figure of Keller of, there's another classic Keller story where like he attacks some ship, and people in Fiume at the time are going hungry, and so they're stealing food, and he sees this pig and decides he's just going to throw the pig in the back of his plane.
Sure.
and you've seen these kind of World War I Red Baron style planes. They're not
right.
Is this the origin of Porco Rosso?
Quite possibly, yes. And what happens is the pig ends up like breaking through the bottom of the plane, and his like feet are sticking out, and Keller still manages to land it.
Fuck.
And by the way, Keller has the same mustache as Porco Rosso as Marco in the movie.
Where were this guy's parents?
They were in Milan getting rich.
God damn it.
Being bougie.
Trust fund psychopaths.
And Keller's like in his early 20s at this time, right?
Well, obviously.
So yeah, massive.
So it really makes a case for like the bourgeois degeneracy thing, huh?
And this goes on for like about a year, and people, some of these troops start like leaving because this wasn't quite what they signed on for. Well, at the same time, a bunch of people are like joining them from around Europe who are just fascinated. So you end up with all these like Belgians showing up and like just fascinated to hear about like this weird little city state where there doesn't seem to be any law, and not only no law, there's no order. In fact, they're against order. They're very clear that they're against order. Keller's faction actually wanted to abolish money altogether, and like it's a very interesting.
It's always the fucking rich people that are like, I don't need money.
Right. If you want to eat, just go like steal a pig.
Put it in your plane.
Right.
Well, you could have a plane first, but
or just put it on your Camellino.
And at the same time, they brought in some real revolutionaries. I believe Lenin said that D'Annunzio is the only revolutionary in Europe, the only proper revolutionary. And Keller was quite a fan of the Soviet Union too, by the way. And so this, towards the very end, when it started to become clear that Italy wasn't going to annex Fiume, you end up with D'Annunzio deciding, okay, we're just going to create our own country that he called the Italian Regency of Carnaro, that they would hold. He would basically hold power until Italy gets its shit together enough to come and annex it as they should.
Yeah.
So he ends up relying on.
Sorry.
I believe. Yeah.
Help me with this pun. Waiting for Guido.
You don't need help.
Don't need help?
You nailed it.
All right. Let it stand.
So D'Annunzio ends up relying on a few key people to come up with a constitution. Above all, a nationalist syndicalist. He's described in some places as an anarchist syndicalist. I wouldn't quite say that. Because what kind of it's a fucking constitution for a new state. But maybe Ray, have you looked into this guy at all?
I mean, I know something about him. He's called Alceste de Ambris, right? Is that the guy you're talking about?
Ambris Alceste, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something. Alceste de Ambris, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there was so at the time there was a very active so-called revolutionary syndicalist movement as a part of the labor movement, and so those were people who had very similar ideas to anarcho-syndicalists, but many of them didn't consider themselves anarchists and were more aligned to Marxist analysis and ideas. And a part of them embraced nationalist politics, and then this is one of the like founding factions of what later became fascism, not only in Italy but also in France and in Spain. The so-called nationalist syndicalists. So I think he was maybe aligned with this trend. These were some of the followers of Georges Sorel in Italy, and then there were also similar kind of theorists in Italy at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so I think he came from Belgium, if I'm not mistaken, and he was charged with writing the constitution for this new state, the Italian Regency of Carnaro, and it's a fascinating read. I mean, it's the first state, let's say, in Europe, as far as I know, to completely legalize homosexuality. It called for equal pay for men and women. This is like 1920, right?
Didn't it enshrine music in some strange?
Yeah, music was.
So
it was the state.
The foundation of the state would be music.
Yeah,
and any of the kind of weird shit that came in was added by D'Annunzio.
Well, sure, yeah. Music was
straight up.
Music was considered a religious and social institution, both, and it's like I don't. Do you want to talk about the corporations a bit?
Go ahead.
So he had, maybe we know the 5 corporations. That's probably more popular from Italian fascism. But these are I think he had 9 corporations. The most of them are not that interesting. Stuff like civil servants or teachers and students are one corporation. Private bureaucrats, administrators, another. But the interesting one was the one that was called the Heroes and Supermen Corporation. that was there to represent superior individuals, and
like poets,
like poets, for instance. And the legislature was divided up into the Council of Corporations, who handled all the boring shit like public services and all that kind of stuff. And then there was they were called the Council of the Best, which was like like the cool people that got to do fun stuff like control the police and the armed forces and stuff like that, as well as intellectual life.
Right.
There you go.
I mean, this is interesting because they also had like this. They also printed stamps with the portrait of D'Annunzio, and in Latin, they had it said, "This is the best place." I think in Latin. So this is their motto.
Just very out front about it, ain't they? Yeah.
Yeah, and the official slogan for the Regency was "Qui contre nos," like who could be against us?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, look, they got flair.
I mean, all of this really says like a lot of coke.
It really does. It really does.
Yeah,
it does.
Just a straight year of not knowing what to do except coke, and then coming up with the first ever corporatist state, right?
What's funny is all these people came to check it out.
Sure.
It was just like I mean, if you look at the people who came to visit, it's like a who's who of Europe at the time. Like Toscanini, the composer, came. Mussolini gave his first public speech.
Well, Mussolini was obviously a big fan, of D'Annunzio especially.
Yeah.
Keep in mind too, like D'Annunzio was he already at this point part of like the kind of artistic life of Europe? Like he was already a poet, right, and a film maker and stuff like that, no? All right, so he already had these like high class or artsy connections, I'm sure, and so it's more like hey, you remember that guy? Well, he has a state now. Cool.
and Mussolini and D'Annunzio were actually like serious rivals. They despised each other towards the end, but we can get into that later.
I mean,
just going back to
D'Annunzio was the first guy who called himself Duce, no?
Yeah, that's right. He was the original.
Yeah.
The original El Duce.
Yeah, we can go into some of the copyright infringement a bit later, but going back to the Constitution, like one of the things that's in there is this very romantic idea of like you should not work for profit. Like that is degrading to the human soul. You should work as an artisan and see this as see your products, the products of your labor, as a reflection of your soul. And D'Annunzio is like talking about, I forgot what example it was. It was like a fucking windowsill or something.
All right.
Noticing the intricate carving on it. Yeah.
Considering what happens later.
And so he's noticing the intricate carving of something that's like purely useful, but someone had put in this effort to make it special and creative and all of this. And this is the idea that, the product of your labor should be a work of art. Everything you do, everything you do.
I kind of don't hate these people as much as I think I should.
I know that feeling.
The problem is like,
I mean, they're annoying, but like as fascists go,
Well, I mean, they're insane. There's like it's hard to take any of it seriously. But I guess it was it. How hard? Look, Kemal, tell me something. How serious should we take this?
I mean, seriously, it's like, what about the people who shovel shit for a living, like working in a stable? Are you just gonna go, yeah, hey, move that shit over there, but do it artfully?
Yeah.
But, swirled around a little.
I should say though that this Constitution, like pretty much everything else in Fiume, existed largely on paper, and it was. I
mean, it is the Constitution.
There was no, but.
I mean,
it was never put into practice, right? And spoiler alert: this whole project is going to come to an end within 2 months of it being written.
Okay, so soon.
Interesting thing, though, is they also sought to develop a foreign policy at this time, And Guido Keller was one of the people, and then there was a guy from Belgium, forgot his name, but they put together this idea for a League of Fiume. And it was like an anti-League of Nations.
Yeah, which is really funny considering that the League of Nations, as you said earlier, might have considered Fiume as a port of call.
But they didn't. Yeah,
so they made their own little anti-League of Nations.
Yeah. So if you look at who they're appealing to, and they put in some work for this, by the way, they basically sought to unite all of the people who had been fucked over by the international order, and it became like it was envisioned rather as a proper anti-colonial movement. And they're like, we want to unite the people of Afghanistan and Mesopotamia and Uruguay and the blacks in the United States
and Ireland,
and the Chinese in California and Native Americans and the Irish. And actually, they actually got some support from the Irish that actually had some consequences. But it's just kind of amazing to see that, this formation at the time. It largely didn't go anywhere, but this was the idea behind it, that they could possibly serve as a new kind of order for a new world instead of, the new international order being formed through the Paris Peace Accords. So,
it's interesting because Fiume or Rijeka was supposed to be an independent nation, like city-state, and then this was occupied by these guys who didn't want that, who wanted it to be annexed by Italy. But then they started developing these kind of very ambitious ideas of, Fiume being the center of different global politics and so on. I mean, it seems like they would maybe more profit from this situation if this was actually an independent city-state for their plans than for it just being a small city in Italy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
you'd think so.
They managed to form in the same token both fascism and the World Social Forum, apparently.
But I mean, that's the thing that Ray was saying, like, I don't hate them probably as much as I should, but I think it is like, if you ever go out like clubbing or partying with like some people that you don't really know too well, but like, you have a really good time, you do like a lot of drugs and
you steal a pig, you take over a city.
You steal a pig, you get into all kinds of shit. And then, at like 6 a.m, you're having a discussion with like a bunch of people who are all on drugs, and like some people have some really good ideas and they're like throwing that out there. And then, the next day would be like, man, a bunch of those people are fucking idiots.
But it all sounds good on coke.
But like, like, damn, like, I can't believe I chilled with that dude. Like,
Italians really have a different style of proto-fascism from Germans or Serbs or Croats.
It's a lot more fun.
I mean,
I mean, did they even have any like? So far we've heard really nothing at all about race. It seems like it's nowhere in this.
Yeah. So race
were factor even into Italian fascism until much later. I mean, in like the traditional sense.
Well, this is the kind of weird thing is like they were racist for sure. In that they were hardcore nationalists and they believed that the Italian spirit had been corrupted. Right?
Oh, okay.
And so been corrupted largely by outsiders, sure. But, it was a very diverse group of people. Some I'm sure were hardcore racist, others not. Some dabbled in futurism and, the futurists had similar ideas. Some of them were, some of them weren't. Now with Fiume though, it was very much about being Italian, which is weird because like, as we talked about, Italians weren't even a majority in Fiume, right. But at least this group was very much about being Italian. And in the Constitution, they referred to Slavs as the unlettered usurper.
The unlettered. Damn.
Unlettered usurper. Because they're a bunch of backward peasant yokels, as opposed to, the civilization of Dante. And So there was a lot of hostility towards Slavs, and you have reports of some of the Arditi, the legionnaires, supporting D'Annunzio, like smashing windows that were owned by Croats, the windows of shops, but you actually don't have wide-scale violence. And this is the topic of a recent book, actually, like why wasn't there this violence that you would expect? You did have D'Annunzio's troops forcing some Slavs to consume large amounts of castor oil. And
he made people poop to death.
Yeah. And this, along with a lot of the other things that D'Annunzio's troops came up with, was adopted by Mussolini and the black shirts. Including the black shirts, by the way. That was
including, as I understand it, too, the balcony speech, like the kind of Roman salute, all sorts of shit.
Maybe you can talk a bit about this, about the fascist aesthetic. How much it's connected with Fiume and D'Annunzio.
D'Annunzio basically held sway over the fascist aesthetic until like deviant art came out, upset the whole order.
Yeah, so D'Annunzio brought back the Roman salute, and that some people would identify as like the fascist salute or the Nazi salute, the Sieg Heil, whatever. This was an old Roman thing that D'Annunzio purposely introduced to show this continuity of.
We mentioned this earlier in some of the episodes.
That's
I
true,
think there is no evidence historical that it was ever used by Romans. Like there is the first use of it that's like documented is in some 18th century painting.
What's
his
name?
With
some Roman theme, and then it was made popular by this film that was I think somehow D'Annunzio was a collaborator. Maybe he wrote he was the screenwriter for the film called Cabiria, which also has a Roman theme, and it was used there. So I think it was kind of made in the popular imagination as a Roman thing, but it was basically a modern invention, like many of these things.
Invented tradition.
Yeah.
So that was one aspect. The salute, the black shirts, the little cry that they made. What is it?
Yeah.
I la la, something like that. And of course, the title that D'Annunzio took for himself was Il Duce, that Mussolini just straight up ripped off. So just to kind of bring the D'Annunzio chapter to an end here, or at least his time in Fiume, what ended up happening was you had, Christmas Day, I believe, in 1920. You had what he called Bloody Christmas, though not a lot of people actually ended up dying.
I mean, but more than zero is kind of bad on Christmas, though.
Yeah, right. And so you have this Bloody Christmas in which you have the Italian Navy, which had set up a blockade around Fiume, began a bombing campaign to force D'Annunzio out. And so you have this kind of weird inversion where you have Italy attacking the city to get them to stop claiming to be part of Italy and to force them to become independent.
Well, I mean, we talked about this in the last episode about Croatia in the 20s and 30s, but D'Annunzio was making agreements with people in the name of Italy. So, I mean, he met with Ivo Frank and arranged for a potential independent Croatia with the support of Italy.
It should be said that Ivo Frank had the same kind of legitimacy to sign anything in the name of Croatia as D'Annunzio had to sign anything in the name of Italy. They were both
true. He actually had he had a bit more resources than Ivo Frank did, which is the whole point. He agreed to arm them and whatever.
Okay, so I guess before we wrap this up, let's just recap a little bit on this story because there's a lot of little details, and all I remember at this point is the cocaine and the animals.
The donkey.
The highlights here.
Yes.
But in short, you had a World War I hero, a daredevil, a guy that did these amazing feats to lift the spirit of the Italian people or whatever. Essentially does so many drugs, he believes he can retake this relatively, what am I looking for? Inconsequential city on the coast, right? For Italy, who refuses it. This leads to him and a couple thousand other cokeheads and artists and all these freaks essentially having
accidentally inventing fascism. Yeah.
Inventing fascism because they have nothing better to do for like a year while they're waiting for Italy to finally let them in.
Yeah.
Right.
So and that's okay, and that's how fascism begins. Basically, is that what we're saying?
Well, it's debatable, but fascism really begins with Mussolini, who was more inspired by D'Annunzio and was in a fierce contest with D'Annunzio, trying to become the most popular figure in Italy.
He was the Salieri to D'Annunzio's Mozart.
He really was. So after D'Annunzio was chased out of Fiume, he ended up back in Italy, and he was seen as the only potential rival to Mussolini. And coincidentally, right before the March on Rome, which Guido Keller took part in, by the way, D'Annunzio fell out of a window.
No doubt while admiring the artistry of the ledge.
Yes, absolutely. And it's quite possible that someone helped him fall.
That was nice.
That was a popular thing back then, too.
Yeah.
Right. Defenestration.
Classic. So, but he survived. He was injured and kind of woke up in fascist Italy.
Yeah, great. So good. So he falls out of a window and then wakes up to his rival essentially doing what he did and succeeding
on a mass scale.
Yeah.
And found that he had taken his title, his uniforms, his salute,
all of that.
The idea of putting Italian flags in every window, like just totally ripped him off. And this could have been an issue, but it wasn't, because D'Annunzio more or less stepped aside. He still remained politically active and was opposed to Mussolini. But Mussolini once described his relationship with D'Annunzio in a very classic way. He said, when you have a rotten tooth, you have two choices. You can either pull it or you can fill it with gold. And in D'Annunzio's case, I've chosen the latter. And he bought off D'Annunzio. And one of the ways that he bought him off was giving him this palatial estate on Lake Garda in Italy, and basically letting him create his own kind of it ended up being essentially a museum of Italian irredentism. It was like the victory hall of the Italians. And it's a very bizarre place. It's still there. It still brings in a lot of visitors. It has a lot of weird rooms and gardens. There's a waiting room for welcome guests. There's another waiting room for unwelcome guests.
Of course.
There's actually a ship, part of a ship, the bow of the ship, that's been installed in the hillside next to this large villa. And this was an Italian Navy vessel called the Puglia. And the Puglia had been used in World War I, and even before. It had been involved in bombing Yemen during Italy's war with the Ottoman Empire. And during World War I, it's most famous for being one of the ships that helped the Serbian army flee Durrës when they had been routed. And so it became, a pretty prominent ship with this kind of rich history. And around the time of D'Annunzio's exploits, when, Zadar had already gone to the Italians, this ship was sent to the city of Split in Dalmatia. And there was fear that Split, too, would become an Italian city.
That Split might
and right, and the ship was stationed right off the coast in Split, and it caused a great deal of unrest among the people of Split who did not want Split to go to the Italians, and basically a bunch of pissed off Dalmatians stormed the ship and murdered the captain.
Oh,
and the ship ended up being like chopped up, but Mussolini saved a piece of it, the bow, and gave it to D'Annunzio. And D'Annunzio had it installed on the hill next to his estate in Lake Garda, pointing across the Adriatic at Split.
Yeah, listeners can actually see this thing if they go to YouTube. I was wondering what the fuck it was, actually, but there's a video there, I think, called D'Annunzio Speaks in his first talkie. And it features that ship very prominently, the bow anyway. Looks weird as fuck.
So, yeah, D'Annunzio had essentially been bought off and allowed to build this crazy museum, which is still there. And he's buried there. Guido Keller, he ended up going abroad. He went to South America and explored the Amazon and was looking for gold in Peru, and then ended up returning to Italy, where he was kind of penniless towards the end, and his end was in his mid-30s, by the way. And he was killed in a car accident where he was with some other Italian war hero, and their car smashed into the side of a bridge, and they were both killed. And so Keller is also buried at this palace on Lake Garda, along with D'Annunzio and a few others.
Apparently, before he died, D'Annunzio had a few meetings with Mussolini, and he tried to persuade him to cut his relations with Hitler. Like, he was for some reason not.
Yeah, he wasn't a fan of Hitler. Yeah,
Even
though Hitler was certainly familiar with his work.
Maybe not. I think I'm not sure. He doesn't sound like Hitler would be a fan of him.
Well,
I don't know.
Where'd they get that the old salute from? You think they took it from the painting independently?
They took it from Mussolini.
From Mussolini.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like when someone's talking about, some movie, and it's like, oh, that was a book first, and they had only seen the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, funny you should mention that, because I was just now wondering if Hunter S. Thompson had taken over a small coastal town in Florida, and would I sign up? I might have done it.
Yeah, but Hunter Thompson wasn't a fascist. I mean,
yeah, but neither. He wasn't. He was not a nationalist
when he
at
ran
all.
for office.
Hated the state.
When he ran for office in Colorado or whatever, it was an absurd. He had an absurd platform, but in general, it wasn't. He wasn't a right wing guy. He also said that his favorite American political force were the Wobblies.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, this would be
been a lot better.
If Hunter Thompson was also a part of the QAnon movement,
right?
Then they invaded a city in Cuba and claimed it for the America, but also made it a kind of ridiculous QAnon state there.
Yeah.
So
I'd probably stay away from that. Yeah.
I think the greatest parallel we have is what's the fucking guy, the virus software dude, McAfee or whatever. McAfee, who lives in that he has that compound in Guatemala where he has a bunch of child brides and does tons of drugs and does weird internet videos about conspiracy theories and shit.
All right.
I mean,
it's kind of more D'Annunzio-ish.
But then if that guy also made feature-length films and was also a celebrated poet.
There's also Don Black, the founder of Stormfront.
Yeah, he tried to invade Dominica?
Yeah, in 81. Yeah. Also a failed invasion.
It's actually kind of hard to put this fascist label on D'Annunzio and his followers. I mean, certainly aesthetically, they were there, and with some of the corporation stuff, obviously. But if you look at the kind of trajectories that D'Annunzio and his followers went after this whole Fiume thing, you end up with a lot of them joining the fascist movement. These Arditi, the black shirts,
right?
And then a bunch of them joined the Arditi del Popolo, who were like the anti-fascists.
Right.
Yeah. Including Alceste de Ambri, who we mentioned, who wrote the constitution for Fiume. He actually joined the anti-fascist Arditi del Popolo.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, but okay, this is why there is this term proto-fascist. I mean,
Right.
Which I think in this case is highly accurate.
Yeah.
But I mean, modern Italian fascists, a lot of them do like D'Annunzio. There was that. So what was it? It was the 100-year anniversary of D'Annunzio's landing in Fiume. A bunch of Italian fascists tried to invade Rijeka.
Yeah.
Right.
And some of them made it through and, put a big Italian flag in that like kind of main square area, I think in front of the theater in Rijeka. But one of those, a couple of them actually tried to fucking fly a plane, like a small like Cessna or something.
Well, there you go.
To pull to Rijeka and got turned away by the Croatian Air Force or something. And this is in 2019, so this
stay the fuck away from our pigs.
and after this whole Fiume experiment with D'Annunzio, Fiume did become an independent state. It was one of the smallest states in Europe. Obviously, it's I believe smaller than Vatican City.
Is it smaller than Liberland?
And it's kind of famous for having its own communist party that was represented in the Second International, right? Like
or third,
because yeah. So every country like had their own communist party, and I think they didn't. The Communist Party in Fiume didn't even have like a delegation to send. I think they just sent the entire party.
Both of them.
And then Rijeka became a part officially of Yugoslavia after the Second World War.
Yes. So this independent state lasted until 1924 when Mussolini finally came in and annexed it. So
it finally got its wish. Well, D'Annunzio.
Well, part of it, yeah. The Fiume part on the west side of the canal became part of Italy, while Sushak, the neighborhood on the east side, became part of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia.
Before we end this, maybe just to mention also that D'Annunzio had a couple of kids. One of them he named he was Mini-Me. His name was Gabrielino D'Annunzio, who also wanted to be like a poet film guy. He made a couple of films, one about his dad's poetry. The other one was this like historical epic that flopped and then he just vanished. And the other one, what's the other one's name?
Ugo D'Annunzio.
Ugo D'Annunzio.
Son of the late Gabriele D'Annunzio, paid a $50 fine.
Yeah, for what?
Here today on the charge of assault, arising from an accident on May 22nd when his airplane crashed into an automobile at Sevarsky Field, East Farmingdale, injuring Mrs. Susie H. Jones of Huntington.
Yeah, this is...
Captain D'Annunzio did not testify.
This is in Babylon, a town called Babylon in New York. And
yes.
So this guy manages to... This is how his daredevil dad, right, who does this amazing flying epic trip over Vienna, and his son crashes his plane into a car somehow, which to me is sort of like if you manage to like stab yourself with like a gun, like how do you...
Yeah,
I don't think it was flying. I think he might have. It was probably still on the ground or something. I don't know.
Didn't even get off the ground.
Yeah. No, I guess not.
Even
a
worse.
Particularly accomplished pilot.
So yeah,
crashing into cars and shit.
So that's D'Annunzio's legacy: a couple of failed sons and a museum to irredentism. Oh, and Nazis.
Oh, yeah.
Well, fascists.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, I think. Thank you, Kemal, for once again joining us. This was a lot of fun. I definitely learned more about a place that I've actually been to a couple times, but didn't know that exact history. So, thank you, Kemal, and hope to have you back again soon.
It's been a pleasure.
All right.
Let's see you later.
Ciao.
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 I'll be back.